The Clementine Tree restaurant operated in a restored colonial townhouse in central London, on a cobblestone street where the 21st century seemed to have forgotten to knock. The exposed brick walls held paintings by anonymous London artists, and the aroma of mushroom risotto and expensive red wine permeated the air decades ago and never left. It was the kind of place where silence came at a high price, where conversations were whispered like state secrets, and where the wait for a table could reach 6 weeks for those who didn't know the maître personally. Eleanor Davies arrived on a Tuesday morning, carrying her worn leather bag and a restrained smile that didn't reveal much. She was 26 years old, with dark brown eyes that observed everything without seeming to observe anything, and a deliberate way of walking that the older staff would soon notice as different. It wasn't the nervous rush of typical job applicants. It was the calm of someone who had already worked too much to be afraid of work. Mrs. Higgins, the dining room supervisor, received Eleanor in the back office with the tired expression of someone who has hired and trained too many newcomers and knows half of them will leave in 3 weeks. She read the resume unhurriedly. 2 stints at bistros in Notting Hill, a season at a boutique hotel in Mayfair, a technical gastronomy course at the Culinary Arts Institute of London, and at the top of the paper, a line that caught her attention. Incomplete bachelor's degree in psychology, Westminster University. Temporary leave for financial reasons. Mrs. Higgins folded the paper and placed it on the table with calculated delicacy. "Here you'll learn more about human behavior than in any classroom," she said, and she wasn't joking. "But I need you to know one thing before you say yes. There's a table in this restaurant that the rest of the team calls the guillotine." She paused. "Table 12, south window, regular client. Every Saturday night at 8 o'clock. I've already fired 3 waitresses who served that table and resigned in tears. I've had 2 waiters who needed medical leave for anxiety attacks. The client in question is Mrs. Isabella Sterling Fairfax, wife of businessman Richard Sterling of Sterling Group Holdings." Another pause. "Do you know the name?" Eleanor knew. Every English person who followed economic news knew. The Sterling Group owned shopping centres, a chain of health plans, and a considerable share of a telecommunications operator. Richard Sterling appeared on lists of the country's richest men with the regularity of someone who never leaves that list. "I know the surname," Eleanor replied. "The wife is another story," Mrs. Higgins said. "She doesn't appear in interviews. She has no social media profiles. She attends the right events, wears the right clothes, talks about the right causes. But in here, she's different." The supervisor chose the word with visible care. "She has a way of finding each employee's weak spot and pressing until the person crumbles. She doesn't yell, she doesn't directly insult. It's all very refined. A look, a raised eyebrow at the wrong moment, a comment about the wine's temperature that on the surface is just a technical observation, but in practice is a sentence." Eleanor listened attentively, without her facial expression changing much. "I can serve that table," she said. Mrs. Higgins studied her for an instant. "You don't want to think about it?" "I already have." The following Saturday night, Eleanor arrived an hour early and reread the menu twice, memorizing the pairings and ingredients of each dish. She adjusted her white apron in front of the staff bathroom mirror, pulled her hair back into a tight bun, and went to the dining room. Isabella Sterling Fairfax arrived at 8:02. She entered the dining room like someone entering territory that belonged to her by natural right. She wore a navy crepe dress that was clearly designer European, a discreet pearl necklace, and impeccably straight ash blonde hair. She was in her early 50s in a way that required effort and money to maintain. Beside her, Richard Sterling, a tall man with white hair and the air of someone who had spent the last 30 years signing important papers, walked a step behind like a satellite in established orbit. Eleanor greeted them at table 12, with the exact cordiality the situation demanded, neither too subservient nor too distant. She handed the menus with both hands, mentioned the specials of the day with a clear, unhesitating voice, and retreated just enough. Isabella opened the menu without looking at Eleanor. She remained silent for a time that would be uncomfortable for anyone not trained to wait. Then she spoke without raising her eyes from the paper. "The candle is crooked." Eleanor looked at the candle. It was slightly tilted, about 3 degrees at most. Without saying a word, she straightened it with 2 fingers and a precise adjustment. Yesterday's bread was still in the basket when the previous table was cleared, Isabella said, this time looking at Eleanor with assessing grey eyes. I hope that's not standard here. It is not, madam. The basket is changed with each service, Eleanor replied in the same steady tone. Isabella didn't respond. She returned her gaze to the menu. And it was at that exact moment, in that instant of controlled tension and silence heavy as velvet, that the first strange thing happened. Richard Sterling asked a simple question about the risotto, whether the parmesan was imported or domestic, and Isabella answered before Eleanor could. She answered in a slightly impatient tone, at a different rhythm from her polished London accent. It was a fraction of a second. An open syllable where it should have been closed, an E that slipped into a rural I, which came and went like a leaf carried by the wind before anyone could be sure they'd seen it. Eleanor saw it. Her expression didn't change. She didn't blink faster. But something inside her lit up with that microscopic discrepancy, like a thread pulled in a seemingly perfect fabric. At the end of the dinner, Isabella complained that the chocolate in the molten chocolate cake was too cold inside, which was, technically, how the dish was supposed to be served. Eleanor apologized and offered a substitute dessert, which was refused with a dismissive wave of the hand. When the couple left, Eleanor went to clear the table. Beneath the folded napkin on the coffee saucer, there was a cash tip. The exact amount, not a penny more or less, calculated with the coldness of someone who wants to leave no room for interpretation of generosity. Eleanor picked up the money and looked at the candle she had straightened. She thought about the fraction of a second of the accent. She thought about the way Isabella tapped her fingers on the tablecloth while waiting for the change. A particular rhythm. 3 quick taps and a pause, 3 taps and a pause, which didn't match the woman in pearls and navy crepe who had been sitting there. And she thought of something else too. Throughout the night, Isabella's left glove had slipped up slightly twice, and both times she had adjusted it with a quick, almost automatic gesture, like someone hiding something out of a habit so old they no longer notice they're doing it. There's a version of every person that they never show to anyone, Eleanor thought as she folded the napkin. The problem is when that version is the true one. She picked up the tray, returned to the kitchen with her usual calm steps, and was already formulating a plan. On the Monday after the first Saturday at table 12, Eleanor woke at 6 in the morning, put water on to boil, and opened her laptop on the kitchen table of the apartment she shared with a course colleague in Bethnal Green. The apartment was small, the walls were thin, and the window overlooked a busy street. But at 6 in the morning, the silence had a special quality she had learned to use. It was when she thought most clearly. She opened the search engine and typed, Isabella Sterling Fairfax. The results were, for the most part, about her husband. Richard Sterling at inaugurations, Richard Sterling at financial sector awards, Richard Sterling in interviews for business magazines. Isabella appeared in some photos beside him, always in the same role of discreet and elegant wife. No social media profiles, no mention of her own interviews, no record of any public cause declared in her name. The page for the Sterling Institute, the couple's philanthropic foundation, listed her as honorary director, but there was no photo, no quote, absolutely nothing that revealed who the woman was before she was the wife of. Eleanor tried other combinations: Isabella Fairfax London, Isabella Sterling Philanthropy, Isabella Fairfax Origin, Isabella Fairfax Family. In no result was there any reference to parents, siblings, hometown, school, university, anything prior to her marriage to Richard. It was as if Isabella Sterling Fairfax had been born an adult, already dressed in navy crepe, already with the polished accent and the pearl necklace in place. This erasure was not accidental. Eleanor knew this intuitively, with the part of her that had read Freud and Foucault in social psychology classes before dropping out of university. Erasing an origin was always an active project, not a passive omission. Someone had worked to create this void. She closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and went to work. That week, Eleanor asked Mrs. Higgins to schedule her for every possible shift on the days Isabella usually appeared. The supervisor looked at her with that half-suspicious, half-relieved expression of someone who no longer had to worry about table 12, and agreed without asking much. On Wednesday night, Isabella appeared with two friends for a quick dinner. Eleanor served them. She observed. The friends talked a lot, gestured, laughed with a certain spontaneity. Isabella smiled at the right moments, made the right comments, but there was a millimeter distance between her and the conversation, as if she were a step behind herself watching her own performance. It was that night that Eleanor saw the scar. Isabella had arrived without the long gloves of Saturday, wearing only a wide white gold bracelet on her left wrist, and at one point, when she reached for her water glass and the bracelet slipped a centimeter, a pinkish horizontal scar, about 4 centimeters long, appeared just above her wrist. The scar was old, clearly, but it had a specific shape that Eleanor recognized. It wasn't the kind of mark that comes from a domestic accident or a fall. It had the texture of a burn from a hot, flat surface like a griddle, the kind that happens in industrial kitchens, where contact is inevitable when movement is too fast and space is too small. Isabella noticed the bracelet slip in a fraction of a second and adjusted it with a gesture so automatic that her friends didn't notice. But Eleanor was watching. Returning home that night on the Central Line tube, Eleanor silently pieced together the puzzle: a slipping accent, a griddle burn scar. The rhythm of tapping fingers she had noticed on the first Saturday, 3 taps and a pause. 3 taps and a pause, which was the rhythm of someone who had spent years waiting for orders to be prepared and counting the seconds with their fingers on the counter. The systematic hostility towards restaurant staff that didn't have the indifferent coldness of the born rich, but rather the active cruelty of someone who needs to mark territory they know is fragile. These were clues. Clues that pointed in a direction that seemed too improbable to be true, and for that very reason was the most probable of all. The following Saturday, during the couple's dinner, Eleanor was serving the appetizer when Richard Sterling casually mentioned a trip they would take in the winter, speaking of escaping the heat. Isabella responded without thinking. "Real heat, you don't know what it is, darling. Where I came from, in the summer you could wring the air." A pause. Very brief. Isabella realized what she had said. She immediately corrected herself. "I mean, in the places where I vacationed as a child, in the countryside. Very humid." Richard nodded with the distracted air of someone thinking of something else. Eleanor moved away from the table with the tray, but what she had heard echoed. "Where I came from. Countryside, humid summer, the northeastern region of Yorkshire, which had that kind of humid, heavy heat that clung to the skin in summer, different from the dry heat of other regions." The following week, Eleanor spent 3 nights awake late navigating digitized archives of Yorkshire countryside newspapers that had been scanned by regional memory preservation projects. It was tedious work, looking page by page of yellowed newspapers in pixelated PDFs, searching for she didn't quite know what. A face, a name, something. It was in the early hours of a Thursday morning that she found it. The newspaper was the Dales Chronicle, from a town called Oakwood-on-Ayr in Yorkshire, with a weekly circulation. The online archive went from 1992 to 2002, digitized by a municipal project that seemed to have been abandoned midway. The photo that stopped Eleanor's eyes was in the August 1998 edition, on a local events page with the title, "St. Grace's Church Summer Fair Elects Pie Contest Winner." The image was grainy, black and white, slightly crooked as if the camera had shaken. It showed a young woman in her early 20s, blonde, smiling with a pie in her hands. The caption read, "Izzy Fisher, from Mr. Gerald's Snack Bar, wins for the 2nd consecutive time with her famous creamy chicken pie." Eleanor enlarged the image as much as the file allowed. The resolution was terrible, but the light eyes were there, the structure of the face was there, the smile was there, looser, more naive, completely different from Isabella Sterling Fairfax's calculated smile, but undeniably the same smile. Izzy Fisher, waitress at Mr. Gerald's Snack Bar in Oakwood-on-Ayr. Eleanor looked at the photo for a long time, feeling the weight of a truth that was not yet hers to carry, but that was there, waiting. She saved the image, closed the laptop, and sat in the dark of the kitchen for a long time, listening to the cars outside on the street. She thought about the woman who had fled a roadside snack bar and built an entire life on the fantasy that that place, that person, that blonde girl with the pie in her hands had never existed. She thought about how much effort that must cost, how many years of constant vigilance, of automatic correction, of adjusting the bracelet over the scar, of swallowing the accent every time it rose to her throat. And she thought of something else, all the cruelty, the destroyed employees, the table the team called the guillotine. All of that wasn't power. It was fear. It was the chronic, exhausted fear of someone who knows the mask can fall at any moment, and that if it falls, the world they built will fall with it. That didn't make the cruelty acceptable, but it made the story much more complicated than it seemed. Eleanor had an aunt named Margaret who lived in Harrogate, a Yorkshire town on the banks of the River Ouse, about 200 kilometres from Oakwood-on-Ayr. She wasn't close enough to know everything about everything, but in small towns in the English countryside, distance doesn't prevent gossip from travelling long distances with remarkable efficiency. Margaret was a retired teacher, 62 years old, knew half the county by name and family history, and loved a Sunday afternoon chat. Eleanor called on a Sunday morning because she knew her aunt would be in the kitchen making lunch and would have time to talk unhurriedly. "Aunt Margaret, do you know Oakwood-on-Ayr?" "I know it by name and by passing through. I went once for a cousin of my friend Benedicta's wedding many years ago. Small town, about 8,000 inhabitants, right near the River Ayr, why dear. Do you remember a snack bar there, Mr. Gerald's snack bar?" There was a pause. The sound of a spoon hitting a pot stopped. "Gerald Phytosa's, the snack bar on the side of the A road? Of course I remember. We stopped there on the way to the wedding. Plenty of food, good price, that country kitchen heat that sticks to your hair but makes you feel at home." A short laugh. "Why do you ask?" "There was a waitress there at that time, blonde, named Izzy." This time the pause was longer, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice had a different quality, that mix of astonishment and pleasure that older country folk have when a story they thought forgotten suddenly resurfaces. "Izzy Fisher," Margaret said slowly, as if tasting the name. "Good heavens. It's been about 25 years since I heard that name. How did you get into this story, Eleanor? Can you tell me about her?" Margaret went to get a chair, because a good story isn't told standing up. Eleanor picked up the notebook she used for study notes and opened it to a blank page. Izzy Fisher had been born in Oakwood itself, daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress, a simple but honest family according to Margaret. From a young age she was known for two things, for being beautiful in a way that attracted attention in the small town and for being determined in a way that sometimes scared people. "That girl never stood still," Margaret said. "She worked since she was 15. Gerald's snack bar was her job, but she always said it was temporary. She said she was going to get rich, that she was going to move to the big city, that she was going to have a different life. People found it funny. They used to comment that Izzy had delusions of grandeur." "And the accent?" Eleanor asked. "Did she have a strong country accent?" Margaret laughed genuinely now. "She did, dear. That broad Yorkshire accent, those vowels that open like barn doors. But she practiced hiding it. Everyone knew. She'd listen to London radio and try to imitate the announcer's diction. The whole town laughed, but with affection, you know. Everyone liked Izzy deep down, even if she was a bit showy." Eleanor wrote it down. "Do you remember any striking incident involving her at work?" New silence. Longer this time. And then Margaret began to laugh in a way she was clearly trying to control and couldn't. "Oh my God," Margaret said, still laughing. "That became a legend in Oakwood. Do you want to know about the Councillor Arthur Finch incident?" Eleanor held her pencil. "Tell me." The story Margaret told lasted 15 minutes, full of detours and side details that were her narrative style. But the core was this. On a Saturday in 1999, Councillor Arthur Finch, a fat, pompous man known for speaking loudly and treating those he considered inferior badly, went to lunch at Mr. Gerald's snack bar with a group of constituents. It was a busy day, the snack bar was full, and Izzy was serving with the speed of someone handling 3 tables at once. In a moment of haste and inattention, she spilled the entire tray onto the councillor's lap. It wasn't a tray of drinks, it was a full tray. 2 plate lunches with beans, rice and chicken, 2 glasses of cashew juice, and a generous portion of French fries, which were the house specialty. "I wasn't there, but those who were told me the silence lasted about 3 seconds, Margaret said. Then the councillor started screaming, called Izzy incompetent, careless, Several ugly things I won't repeat. And Izzy, who was already red with shame, turned red with anger. And then she spoke. What did she say? "Oh, my dear," she said, in that broad accent of hers, and a voice I imagine was quite loud because it reached every corner of the snack bar. "You'll stop yelling at me because I'm not a dog, you puffed-up windbag." Margaret paused to catch her breath between laughs. With all that, in the broadest Yorkshire accent you can imagine, in front of his constituents, with French fries sliding down his tie. Eleanor didn't write. She looked at her notebook for a second, feeling that confirmation click into place precisely. The phrase, the accent, the public shame. This was the foundational moment. This was the episode Izzy Fisher had spent entire decades trying to bury. And then, Eleanor asked, then the councillor left looking like a tomato. His constituents were embarrassed. The snack bar talked about it for months. The phrase became a catchphrase in town. Kids used it, everyone knew. And Izzy was mortified. Those who knew her say she was never the same after that. About 6 months after the incident, she left. She left a letter for Mr. Gerald saying she needed to try life somewhere else. Never came back. Never sent news. Margaret paused more softly. "Do you know where she is?" Eleanor looked out the apartment window. Down on the street, a child ran after a dog, screaming with laughter. The Sunday sun entered obliquely through the window and made a golden stripe on the wooden floor. "I'm not sure yet," Eleanor said, which was a half-truth. After she hung up, she sat with the notebook on her lap. The story was complete now, every piece in place. The blonde girl who had fled the snack bar and the shame who had changed her name, erased her tracks, learned a new accent, married the right man, and built a second identity so elaborate it was almost convincing. Almost. What Eleanor felt wasn't triumph. It was a heavy, quiet sadness. The sadness of understanding that the woman who humiliated waitresses every week in an elite London restaurant was still deep down that girl with the fallen tray, desperately trying to prove she was never who she was. But understanding was not absolution, and the Clementine Tree team was truly suffering. Eleanor closed the notebook, went to the kitchen, made more coffee, and thought about how to use what she knew and if that was the path she wanted to follow. The answer wouldn't come easy, but at that moment she didn't need it yet. What she needed was another week of observation, because the story hadn't yet reached its most difficult point. Isabella Sterling Fairfax noticed the change in mid-September, on a Saturday night, when Eleanor served table 12 with her usual calm, but with one different detail. She didn't avert her gaze when Isabella stared at her. It wasn't insolence, it was something more subtle, harder to name. The absence of habitual fear, perhaps. The absence of that small contraction in the shoulders that all the other female employees had when approaching the table. Isabella performed her usual test, a comment about the soup's temperature being technically correct but aesthetically uninteresting, and Eleanor responded with impeccable courtesy and eyes that didn't waver. This bothered Isabella in a way she couldn't ignore. Over the following weeks, she intensified her tests. She asked for the bread to be replaced because it had yesterday's texture, even though the bread had come out of the oven 2 hours earlier. She questioned the pairing of a wine that the Clementine Tree's most experienced sommelier had personally chosen. She left a note on the folded napkin addressed to the manager, describing a supposed service failure that hadn't existed. Eleanor responded to each of these tests without altering her rhythm, without blushing, without stammering. She attended, corrected what needed correcting, held her gaze, and kept her professional smile in place. And it was precisely this imperturbability that made Isabella decide she needed to act differently. In the first week of October, she called the Clementine Tree during operating hours, asked for the general manager, a man named Fabian, who treated the Sterlings like royalty, and made a precise request. She was organizing a crucial business dinner for October 18th, a Thursday. There would be 8 people, she and her husband, plus 3 foreign partners from Sterling Group Holdings and their respective spouses. The group was finalizing an investment partnership with a German company, and that dinner was, in Isabella's words, the turning point. She wanted the main dining room's private table. She wanted the full tasting menu with wine pairing, and she wanted the service to be handled exclusively by the new waitress, the calm young woman with her hair tied back. Fabian was speechless for a second. because the private table required a minimum of 3 waiters, and that was outside protocol. Isabella said she wasn't asking for an opinion on protocol. She was informing him how the event would be, and that it would pay enough to cover the restaurant's revenue for a typical weekend. Fabian agreed. He called Eleanor into the office the next day and explained the situation with the air of someone delivering both a good thing and a trap. "Mrs. Sterling specifically requested your service. It's a high-level dinner, 8 people, international partnership involved. For you, it's a golden opportunity." Pause. "But you know how she is." "I know," Eleanor said. "If she finds a reason to complain about you in front of the investors, she'll use it." "I know," Eleanor said again. Fabian studied her with the same expression Mrs. Higgins had used in the interview, that mix of suspicion and hope. "Do you want to think about it?" "I don't need to." That night, after her shift, Eleanor sat on a park bench near Victoria Station, with her notebook on her lap and her pen still. She thought for a long time. She thought about Isabella, who was setting a public trap, and she thought about the previous waitresses who had resigned in tears, and she thought about Bennett, the 43-year-old sous chef who had taken medical leave 2 months ago with panic disorder after Isabella's comment about a sauce he had spent 3 hours preparing. Bennett had returned, but he wasn't the same. Everyone in the kitchen knew. Then she thought about Izzy Fisher, about the girl who had dropped the tray and yelled that phrase and disappeared in shame on a night in 1999, and who had spent a quarter of a century building an armor of pearls and navy crepe over that night. She thought about how much that armor must cost, in energy, in vigilance, in cruelty distributed to others, so that fragility would never again be hers. There was a difference between using what she knew to protect herself and to destroy. Eleanor needed to clearly know what her objective was. She opened her notebook and wrote a line at the top of the page. "I don't want to destroy anyone, but I also won't let them destroy me." On the morning of October 18th, Eleanor arrived at the restaurant at 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours before dinner. She studied the entire tasting menu with Chef Matthew, a serious and talented man who didn't like Isabella but respected her with the professionalism of someone who knows how to separate person from client. She reviewed the pairings with sommelier David, memorized the names and pronunciations of the German wines that would be served, and spent half an hour understanding the profile of the foreign investors. What types of allergies were common? What table etiquettes were different in Germany? At 7:30, half an hour before the guests arrived, she went to the bathroom, looked at her reflection in the mirror for a moment, adjusted her apron, and took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid. She felt something closer to clarity, a cold and tranquil resolve of someone who knows exactly where they stand. Isabella arrived at 8 o'clock sharp with her guests. The group was exactly as Eleanor had imagined. 3 middle-aged German couples, well-dressed, cordial, slightly uncomfortable with the ostentatious grandeur, and Richard Sterling beside his wife with his usual satellite air. Isabella wore a dark red dress that was clearly a deliberate choice for the setting, and greeted the guests with the fluent, polished English she had learned to speak. Eleanor received them with impeccable protocol. She greeted each guest in the correct language, seated everyone with discreet efficiency, and presented the menu with unhurried clarity. The Germans were visibly at ease. Richard made a joke in English and one of the investors genuinely laughed. The dinner started well. Isabella observed everything with those narrowed grey eyes that Eleanor already knew. Every perfect dish that came out was a blow to the hostess's strategy. Every discreet compliment from the guests about the service was an annoyance. Eleanor served the 5 appetizers without a single flaw. She kept the glasses filled at the exact moment. She cleared plates with professional invisibility. The trap was set. But the prey had arrived prepared, and Isabella, realizing that the dinner was slipping out of her control, began to tap her fingers on the tablecloth. 3 quick taps. A pause. 3 taps. A pause. Eleanor saw it. She continued serving. The main course was a lamb loin with wine reduction and creamy polenta. When Eleanor placed it in front of Isabella with her usual delicacy, Isabella looked at the plate for a few seconds and then raised her eyes to Eleanor with an expression that the rest of the table wasn't looking in the right direction to see, but which Eleanor recognized as the decision that had been made. "This dish," Isabella said in a sufficiently loud voice, was served with the sauce on the wrong side. I had already specified to the restaurant that I prefer the sauce separately. She tilted her head slightly. This demonstrates a basic negligence that I truly did not expect on a night like this. Silence at the table. The German investors looked on, not quite understanding what was happening. Richard looked at the dish, and then at his wife with an expression that contained several layers of knowledge about this type of situation. Eleanor stood still for 2 seconds. Then she looked at Isabella with the same calm gaze as always. And then something changed in that gaze. It was no longer just calm, it was recognition. Isabella felt it before she understood what she was feeling. Eleanor leaned slightly forward to serve the sauce separately, and when her face was level with Isabella's, she spoke in a low voice, almost at the limit of audibility, only for whoever was sitting in that chair. "Izzy," Eleanor said. A single syllable, a single 4-letter name that hadn't been spoken aloud near Isabella Sterling Fairfax in 25 years. The reaction was involuntary and instantaneous. The blood drained from Isabella's face in a way she couldn't control, and the fingers that had been tapping on the tablecloth suddenly stopped like a mechanism that had lost power. The 2 seconds that followed the name were the longest of that night. Isabella remained absolutely motionless, with the rigidity of someone hit by an invisible electric current. The table continued its conversation around them, the Germans talking about a trip to the Pantanal that one of the partners had made the previous year. Richard making the right comments at the right times, with the well-calibrated autopilot of someone who had been doing this for decades. No one was looking at Isabella and Eleanor. Then Isabella recomposed herself. Eleanor saw the process happen. The jaw that relaxed, the shoulders that dropped a millimeter, the eyes that went from panic to calculated coldness, with a speed that was, she had to admit, impressive. It was the speed of someone who had practiced this return to control for many years. "Excuse me," Isabella said in a low voice, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't understand." Eleanor placed the sauce separately with delicacy. She stood, with both hands behind her back, and looked at Isabella with the same calm gaze as always. There was no anger in that gaze. There was no triumph. There was something that was almost kindness, inasmuch as kindness can coexist with resolve. "You heard me," Eleanor said in the same low voice that the table around them couldn't catch. "And you know that I know. That's why you arranged this dinner this way, because you thought that if you exposed me here in front of these people, I would have no way out." A very brief pause. "But you didn't think that I might also come prepared." Isabella kept looking at her. The smile remained in place, applied like a prosthesis, but there was something in her eyes that was pure calculation. She was weighing options, measuring risks, trying to find a way out that would save the situation. "You're making things up," Isabella said calmly. "I don't know what you're talking about, and if you continue with this nonsense story, I'll call the manager right now and ensure you're dismissed tonight." "You can do that, madam," Eleanor said, "but first, let me remind you of a few things." She leaned slightly forward, at an angle that would appear from a distance to be the gesture of a waitress checking if the customer needed anything. "I remember Mr. Gerald's snack bar in Oakwood-on-Ayr, the blue uniform and the thick-soled white trainers that were mandatory because the floor was slippery tiled." Her voice still low, still controlled. "And the scar on your left wrist, which came from the hot griddle on a busy October day when the snack bar was full and haste was quicker than care." Isabella's composure began to crack underneath, like ice warming from within. The smile became smaller. "You don't know anything," she said, but now her voice had lost some of its polished smoothness, and there was a thread of something different beneath it. "I know about that Saturday in 1999, Eleanor said. "About Councillor Arthur Finch's dinner. I know about the tray, I know about the chicken, the rice, and the portion of French fries that was the house specialty." Pause. "And I know the phrase you said, in that broad Yorkshire accent that you spent years learning to conceal. A phrase that stayed in Oakwood's memory for a long time." The silence that fell upon Isabella at that moment was different from all the other silences Eleanor had observed in that woman. It wasn't the calculated silence of power, it was the paralyzed silence of real fear, the fear of someone who sees the foundation cracking beneath their feet and knows there's no way to hold on. At a nearby table, separated only by a carved wooden screen, Two London society women conversed in low voices. One of them had held her breath for the last 30 seconds, imperceptibly, to follow that low-voiced conversation between the waitress and the hostess, drawn by the change in tone that an ear trained to detect social drama picked up even without understanding the words. Isabella looked around the table as if seeking help. Richard was in conversation with one of the Germans about exchange rates and had leaned slightly to the opposite side. No one was looking at her. And then Isabella did what extreme pressure does to people who have built an entire life on denial. She went in the wrong direction. Instead of retreating, she attacked. "You are a restaurant employee," she said, this time in a voice that was no longer so low, with a sharpness that cut the air near the table. "You have nothing. I will personally ensure that you do not work in any decent establishment in this city." Her voice rose. "You will leave here tonight. Now, I will pay whatever it takes." Richard looked at his wife. The Germans looked. The atmosphere at the table suddenly changed quality, as it does when the heat of a dry afternoon announces rain. Eleanor stood still. She took a deep breath. And then she looked at Isabella in a different way, a way that was neither anger nor cruelty, but firm as stone. "Mr. Gerald passed away in 2003, Eleanor said, in a voice that the whole table now heard. The snack bar closed, but Izzy Fisher's creamy chicken pie remained in the memory of everyone who passed by that road." She paused. "Because it was a very good pie. My Aunt Margaret still talks about it." At the nearby table behind the screen, the woman who had held her breath let out a sound that was between a gasp and a laugh, a sound she tried to suppress with her hand and couldn't entirely. Richard Sterling looked at his wife, he looked at Eleanor, he looked back at his wife, and Eleanor saw on his face the exact moment when the pieces clicked into place. Not all of them, not at that moment, but enough for his expression to change from confusion to something that was the beginning of an understanding that would take weeks to become complete. Isabella stood up. Her chair scraped back with a sound that cut across the dining room. Her face was red in a way that wasn't anger, but the red of shame that had been held for 25 years and now could no longer find the place where it was locked away. She opened her mouth, closed it. She raised her head with the last remnant of posture she still had, and then, without saying a word, she picked up her bag from the chair beside her and walked towards the exit. She didn't run, but she walked too fast for it to seem like a chosen departure. Her heels clicking on the polished floor were the only sound in the dining room for a few seconds. The door opened and closed. The silence that remained was absolute and full. One of the Germans coughed slightly. The other looked at her husband with an expression that silently asked what had just happened. Richard Sterling sat for a moment with his eyes on the door, then looked at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't fully classify, a mixture of astonishment, something akin to recognition, and an enormous, quiet sadness that must have been many years old. "I apologize," he said to the guests in English, with the composure of someone who had spent decades learning to maintain structure when the ground shakes. "My wife is not feeling well. The dinner continues, please." Eleanor took a step back, positioned herself at the correct service distance, and stood there with her hands behind her back. Her heart was beating faster than it appeared. She had thought about this moment for weeks, had planned the words, had carefully chosen each element, but being there in the silence that followed was different from imagining. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was the strange, heavy sensation of having done something necessary that would cause pain. The dinner continued. The lamb loin was eaten. The wines were paired. The conversation returned, more cautious, quieter, but it returned. Helena served each dish with the same precision as always. At the end of the night, when the guests had left and Richard remained alone at the table for a few minutes, looking at his wine glass without drinking, Eleanor approached to clear. "How did you know?" he asked without looking at her. "Observation," Eleanor said simply, "and a call to my aunt." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, still without looking, "I didn't know." Pause. "About her past. She never told me anything before London." Another pause. "But I always thought there was something she kept hidden. Everyone keeps something." He finally looked at Eleanor. "But did you need to do it this way, here, in front of everyone?" Eleanor stopped what she was doing. It was a fair question, and she deserved an honest answer. "She set a trap to publicly dismiss me here tonight," Eleanor said. "I defended myself. It wasn't my first choice." She placed the plates on the tray carefully. "But I admit, I could have been kinder. And that will stay with me." Richard nodded slowly. He drank the wine and sat there for a while longer, alone at table 12, looking out the south window at the cobblestone street where the 21st century had never arrived. In the weeks that followed the dinner of October 18th, the Clementine Tree restaurant returned to what it had been before Isabella Sterling Fairfax became a regular presence, a place of good food, discreet conversations, and a team that worked with the dignity of those who know that what they do has value. Table 12 was no longer called the guillotine. Bennett returned from leave with a firmer step, still cautious but firm. Mrs. Higgins began to greet Eleanor every morning with that brief nod of the head that, in reserved people, is worth a speech. The story, however, did not stay within the restaurant walls. The woman who had choked back a laugh behind the screen on the night of the dinner was named Felicity Graham, a social columnist for a lifestyle magazine with the narrative instinct of someone who had spent 20 years in the business. She hadn't heard all the details of that low-voiced conversation, but she had heard enough to know there was a story. And in the following days, she did what journalists do. She followed the threads. She found the Germans through the public profile of one of the partners. One of them, with classic Germanic frankness, described the incident as an unusual social situation and mentioned Mr. Sterling's wife as the protagonist of the abrupt departure. The text Felicity published 3 weeks later was careful and without explicitly confirmed names, but London has a social class small enough that everyone knew who it was about. The title was "The Mask No One Noticed," and the subtitle asked, "What happens when the persona you built meets someone who knows the original?" There was no vulgar phrase, no compromising details in the text. But there was enough. The reaction was the kind of thing that happens in closed circles, comments at dinners, messages between acquaintances, a board meeting of the Sterling Institute where the awkward silence lasted too long. Isabella had built her social power not on old names or blood, which was what she claimed, but on vigilance and fear. When the vigilance failed, and the fear was no longer hers to spread, the edifice had no foundation to stand on its own. She disappeared from events, from inaugurations, from board meetings of the Institute. She made no public statements. No one knew for sure where she went or what she was doing, but her silence was eloquent in the way that only the silence of people accustomed to making noise can be. Richard Sterling took 3 months to file for formal separation. Eleanor learned from the discreet note in a society column, the kind of note that says a lot without saying anything. Businessman Richard Sterling and his wife end their union after a long shared journey. No judgment, no declaration of rancor. When a reporter managed a quick statement from him leaving a meeting, he simply said, "I wish Isabella the best, genuinely," and added nothing more. Eleanor read the note on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee, and thought about that phrase for some time. The best. It was a simple and enormous phrase. It spoke of a man who, according to everything she had observed in the months at table 12, had built a fortune from the bottom up, and had never been ashamed of where he came from, and who had stood by a woman who had every reason not to need to hide her origin, and had chosen to spend an entire life on that choice. The cruelty had not been only towards the restaurant employees, it had been towards herself as well. That afternoon, Eleanor went to the restaurant, not for a shift, but to talk to Mrs. Higgins. She sat in the same chair where she had interviewed months ago and said with her usual direct calm that she was resigning. Mrs. Higgins was silent for a moment. Then she said, "When?" "End of next month. I want to give time to train whoever comes after." "Where are you going?" "Back to university. Psychology. I'd put it on hold for financial reasons, but I've saved enough in recent months." Eleanor looked through the office windows at the empty morning dining room, with the chairs still on the tables and the light entering obliquely through the blinds. "I think I understand better now why I wanted to take this course. It's not to fix people. It's to understand why they build themselves the way they do." Mrs. Higgins nodded with that slow assent of someone thinking of more than one thing at the same time. "You'll be a good psychologist," she said. And it was the kind of thing that when Mrs. Higgins said it, you knew it wasn't courtesy. On the last Saturday of November, the Clementine Tree team did what teams in places where people spend difficult hours together eventually do. They improvised a celebration. After closing, Chef Matthew brought kitchen leftovers and set up a table in the middle of the empty dining room. Sommelier David opened a bottle of sparkling wine that was destined for the year-end stock and deducted it from the internal events fund with a pen on a piece of paper that no one would check. Bennett brought a cornmeal cake he had made at home, because that was the kind of detail Bennett added to things. They sat around table 12. It was the first time any of them had sat at that table with pleasure. There were short speeches, the kind people make when they aren't orators, but have genuine things to say. David spoke about the day Bennett's leave began, and how the silence in the kitchen had been of a different kind, the silence of someone afraid of being next. Bennett, who didn't usually talk much about himself, said he had spent the first weeks of leave ashamed of having weakened, and that it had taken him a while to understand that shame wasn't the right word. One of the younger waitresses, Chloe, who had arrived 2 months earlier and had never known the harder times, said she had heard the stories, and what impressed her wasn't so much what Eleanor had done, but how she had done it. Without losing her footing, she said, which was a good way to describe it. Eleanor listened attentively and with that small, restrained smile that was her smile, not the smile she wore when being observed, but the one she wore when truly present. She thought of Izzy Fisher from Oakwood-on-Ayr. She thought that she genuinely hoped that somewhere in England or the world, that woman was finding a way back to herself that didn't cost as much as the escape had cost. She raised her glass of sparkling wine when Matthew proposed the toast. "To doing the work we do well," Matthew said, who was a man who expressed himself better with food than with words, and so when the words came, they were always good. The glasses clinked on table 12 with a clean sound. In her last week of work, an envelope arrived addressed to Eleanor at the restaurant reception with no identified sender. Inside was a simple card without a logo, with 2 lines handwritten in a script too elaborate to be natural, the handwriting of someone who learned another person's hand. "You could have done things differently, but so could I. Thank you for not going beyond what was necessary." Eleanor read the 2 lines 3 times. She put the card in her worn leather bag. She didn't comment on it to anyone. It was something that belonged only to her, and in a way to Izzy Fisher too. In February of the following year, Eleanor Davies returned to psychology classes with a new semester of subjects and a notebook full of notes that weren't from any curriculum discipline, but which she knew would inform every interview, every session, and every listening that would come after. She sat in the first row, opened her notebook, and when the professor asked what had brought each of them back to that course, Eleanor thought for a second and said, "The need to understand why people do things that harm themselves to protect themselves from things they've already experienced." The professor wrote that on the board without commenting. It was a good definition of many things. The end of the story. No one wears a mask for decades without reason, and no one removes it without courage. If Eleanor's journey and even Izzy's touched something in you, know that we have many more English stories of strength, secrets, and new beginnings waiting for you. Subscribe so you don't miss any chapters of upcoming stories. Leave a like if this narrative was worth every minute. And in the comments tell us, do you prefer Eleanor's decision or do you think there was another way? The most beautiful story is still in your answer.